Hi everyone, and welcome to another webinar series from Compnow, where we're here talking around cybersecurity again. And I'm delighted to be joined by Glenn Maiden, who's Chief Security Officer and Director of Threat Intelligence at Fortinet. And I think we're going to have a really good conversation around what you're seeing in the market and from your point of view, Glenn. But it'd be great if you gave our audience a bit of an introduction about yourself, a bit of past history and expertise, because it's a great title, and I'm sure you've seen some incredibly, interesting stuff in your time. So a little bit of background would be brilliant.
No, thank you, Julian. So I spent most of my younger years in government as, I guess, sort of a user rather than a vendor. So I spent about 20 years in our Department of Defence, mostly in that sort of intelligence and security environment, most of that around sort of cybersecurity for the most part. I finished off my career in government. I had 4 years as the IT security advisor to our tax office, which is a really interesting experience when you think, we've got to secure some of the, basically one of the biggest databases and repositories of PII in the country, but we still need to be able to connect out to people doing e-tax and tax agents. So, there's some real challenges in those sort of environments. And for the last few years, I've been in the private sector, and now for the last 5 years, I've been the Director of Threat Intelligence for Fortinet Labs, Australia and New Zealand, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, very soon, and also the Chief Security Officer for Fortinet Australia.
Awesome, thank you very much, Glenn. Look, from that vantage point, you've got a head of threat intelligence where you have access to all these data sources around what's going on in this ever-shifting landscape. What are the biggest shifts you're seeing in that, over say like the past 12 months? And really, how do organisations look to use that sort of intelligence to start planning and preparing for what should really be on their radar right now?
I think there's going to be some real good news. I think we tend to be a little bit pessimistic in our industry, just saying, things are bad, the attackers are getting more sophisticated, et cetera. I think in some cases that's a bit overblown. I mean, absolutely the threat is real, the threat is serious. A lot of organisations are unprepared, which is why the number of breaches is high and climbing. But in terms of the sophistication of the bad guys, we're finding that they're becoming, as they have for many years, but again, more sort of industrialised and specialised. There's a lot of innovation around things like initial access, leveraging credentials, leveraging commodity ransomware. So there's some real innovation there. Also on the AI side, which we'll talk about later. So there's definitely bad guys using AI. But the good news for me is, in terms of attack sophistication, apart from that sort of initial access, that initial exploitation, at least from my perspective, the attacks are sort of very understandable after that point. So, we know how the attacker, for the most part, is going to run the attack. And from our perspective and from Compnow's perspective, we've got the tools, the process and the people to be able to combat these attacks. So that's not all bad news.
That's great, and it's good to hear that. And it's a very unusual way to start, because everyone usually goes to the obviously the doom and gloom angle. So it's probably a refreshing take on it. And you're absolutely right. I think we're seeing more noise around these things being front page issues, right? Yes. Where a significant cyber breach suddenly becomes national news, and because it's impacted, from a cyber point of view, I think we've all been personally impacted by certain breaches in certain organisations. And the threat actor behaviour, is there anything still out there that we're not seeing yet, or is there something bubbling up that you'd say is a new threat? I often hear the phrase that digital identity is becoming perhaps the new frontier of where we start seeing these exploits happening. Is there something that really is bubbling up that we should start looking at now, do you reckon?
I'm writing an article at the moment on deepfakes. And again, I think deepfakes is another area where it's probably been a little bit overhyped. But what I think, in terms of something that's bubbling up that I'm sure is going to be affecting us sort of quite profoundly in the next probably 6, 12, 18 months, is when you think of a deepfake, which is basically a synthetic avatar of us that is basically indistinguishable to real. Most people can't tell the difference. But then you start thinking, well, what happens if that converges with that real-time chatbot type functionality? That's where I think things are going to change. And when you think about it at the moment, with deepfakes, they have to be pre-programmed with a script, or it has to have a human to do a face swap or something like that. But if you can have an AI-enabled deepfake that's having a conversation with you for that attack and a conversation with someone else, that's when it starts to be able to be a social engineering attack at scale. So that's the one that I think personally is probably people probably haven't quite gotten onto, and it's something that I'm concerned about.
It's interesting, and it's also very interesting how we've quickly pivoted towards the concept of AI and what AI can do, probably for both good and bad in these scenarios. And one of the things, we're obviously AI is across everyone's mind, from what it's going to do for business transformation, how organizations looking to restructure, take advantage of it. And the business of cyber threats and cyber hacking is a business like every other. Are you seeing times like evidence of, beyond that, AI being used to perhaps shorten the attack time or identify new things? Use the power of AI to basically industrialist scale up that brute force type threat in the marketplace. Are we seeing that? And what does that mean if it is coming down the line to organizations to look out for?
One of the things that I've been most impressed about is and as you say, both on the attack and the defence side, but basically the innovation in the application of AI. So from our perspective, going back even a couple of years ago, when a vulnerability was discovered in a product and it was disclosed, it would probably take months, if not longer, for our adversaries to be able to weaponise that vulnerability and then start attacking our customers in the wild. So there was a real long time. Now that's shortened now, and I don't like to use a figure because it's a little bit rubbery, but anywhere between a week and sort of 2 or 3 weeks is probably the average of when these vulnerabilities are being weaponised by the bad guys. So from worst case scenario, it might only be sort of 3 or 4 days. Otherwise, it might be sort of a couple of weeks. So absolutely, they're using AI to go through to reverse engineer patches and things like that when they come out. So just in that, I think, is really, really keeping us on our toes in terms of we've got less and less time to get hold of a patch, test a patch, deploy a patch before we are under attack.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've noticed is from the customers we engage with, that readiness gap and that time being compressed. We look at organizations of a certain size. The very, very large enterprises have significant teams, significant resources, significant investments, can build processes and governance around that to try and help them close that gap. But we see other organizations, much smaller, much less well-funded, much less well-resourced, and that have got this gap that they're trying to close, but they simply are struggling to do that because they are just as exposed as a large enterprise due to the complexity of their environment. And so when we look at that, given your recent work in intelligence, where do you think that underpreparedness comes from? Is it technology? Is it processes? Is it skills? How should they look to use the intel you have to look at their resources and try and drive down that attack surface and where they're vulnerable to the best of their ability with the resources they have?
I'm actually sympathetic. I think a lot of cybersecurity people can be a little bit judgmental and just say, oh, well, you didn't patch. But without actually having been in the other seat and trying to manage some of these enterprises that you're talking about, I remember even my time in government, with a well-resourced, huge security team trying to deploy a critical patch within 48 hours, getting it through the change management, looking through dependencies, as you mentioned, very, very complex. It was extremely hard, and that was a really big, well-resourced organisation. So, as you say, a smaller organisation, it's even harder. And when you think of the demographics of us here in Australia and New Zealand, we're about 90% plus of our economy is sort of small businesses, 20 or less. Yeah, you can imagine how difficult that must be.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, and that's the good question around the AI industrial scale, this becomes more indiscriminate and more geared towards taking advantage of that very statement, right? That significant portions of the Australian business is, small, medium enterprise. that's going to be something that they're really going to have to look at with tools, processes, and good governance. And we're seeing stronger governance come in, things like Essential A, SIS controls, and so on around how organizations should structure. And I think one of the questions I really wanted to drive in towards is what that looks like for most organizations today. I think many organizations have realized, as we went through the transformations to our business during COVID, and the often told joke is that business and digital transformation was caused by COVID, no matter what everyone else tried to do beforehand. But we've got this challenge now where in that world we have knowingly built because we had to, and now we want to support it because it's more efficient and more user-friendly. We get better staff retention of this fact of hybrid work. My user can be anywhere. The device can be, in many cases, pretty much anything. I've put my data anywhere. SaaS platforms, multi-cloud. That has massively altered the attack surface and altered our traditional approach to perimeter-based security. How do you translate all that into what an organization should be looking at, seeing as we've gone through this huge transformation? The game from a cybersecurity point of view was also changed because the threat actors are also cottoned onto this and are exploiting it. What should we start looking at in that world of any user, any device, anywhere, and how do we start looking to protect that?
I think even from a historical perspective, COVID for me was so fascinating. If that outbreak had happened maybe even 2 or 3 years before, the whole digital transformation, work from home, I don't think the technology would have been able to support that. So just when it happened, obviously that sort of work from home type technology was just emergent, but I think it actually would have flattened the world. COVID would have flattened the world a lot worse. It would have been much more devastating a few years before it happened than when it did. But the interesting thing for me, as you say, as the stimulus to rush us towards that digital transformation, I'm surprised. There's a couple of things, I guess. I'm surprised we didn't have more unforced errors than what we did. I was expecting to see breach after people opened up their systems for work from home. They moved from one system to the next. They put a whole bunch of stuff in the cloud. So there's that. I'm surprised we didn't see more breaches than what we did, and maybe there was a lot that went underreported. But the other side of it too is now, sort of 5 years later, we've got another opportunity. So a lot of these systems that were maybe quite hastily deployed, sort of 2021, 2020, they're up for a refresh now. So now we can actually have a look without that time constraint where we're under such time pressures. We can actually now look and do things properly. So looking at things like zero trust.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key phrases that we've started talking about, things like zero trust. And I think you said a key point I'm going to probably come back to around were they reporting when they had breaches? And obviously we now have much more stringent controls from the governance of the board of directors in organisations around what that means and the personal liability and so on. But given the fact that the architectural underpinnings have changed, are you seeing that organisations are a little bit slower to operationalise around this change window? You said we're 5 years in, right? We typically consume IT in 5 to 7 year cycles. So either you're looking to make that change now, or it's 18 months, 2 years in the planning to look at that. What sort of operational choices and architecture should be people looking at? Bringing in things like threat intelligence, bringing in like day-to-day security controls and architecture. What does that look like for an organisation that's beginning to think, okay, I did the COVID thing well, I've made my investments, I understand and I'm happy where my users are, my data is. What's the next step architecturally, evolutionary, to make them more secure for the next generation?
It's interesting how quickly the threat actors moved. So watching threat actor behaviour just in terms of the FortiGuard Labs telemetry, we watched before all the lockdowns, the attacking organisations. As soon as the lockdowns happened, the threat actors were absolutely immediate in flipping it, and then they started attacking the users. So they were attacking end user devices, home routers, home PCs. So it was very, very quick. So in terms of what we do now, I am a big proponent of when organisations like Fortinet talk about a platform, in some cases we're probably talking mostly about a platform as a security stack. So obviously there's gains to be made by simplifying your security stack, getting rid of multiple or as many different technologies as you can so you can sort of standardise. But from our own perspective with our own incident response and our own intelligence, there's massive gains to be made with what we've already got by improvement of people and process. So there's some real opportunities by just doing, as we said before, by taking a step back. We're not necessarily as under so much pressure now to change things. Have a look at what we've got, look at the processes and refine those, and we can do that, quite easily without necessarily spending a fortune on technology.
Yeah, and I think that's the good thing to hear. It's a process thing, and it's that being accretive. Whatever you've invested in, how do I advance what's been effective for my organisation and so on, and I think you've also touched on a key point around the different technologies that came around that helped during COVID, and what IT and cyber, and sorry to put it in this so bluntly to you, is what we're very good at is coming up with acronyms for everything. Yeah. And we invented an entire alphabet soup of acronyms around how we're going to deal with these problems during that digital transformation. And they've kind of now coalesced into a new acronym, which is Sassy. When we start looking at those investments, I believe that a lot of the coalescence is in towards a Sassy style solution where we acknowledge that, identity is one of the new threats, digital identity that is. I acknowledge that my data is anywhere. I acknowledge that the device is anywhere, that the user could be anywhere. And I acknowledge that my business has to keep functioning in that way to stay relevant and agile and competitive. And that coalescence of everything into Sassy is been, a good thing. When you look at the challenges, how do you think solution stacks like Sassy are helping organisations against these modern threats? And is that a good strategic and architectural way forward for them potentially?
Yeah, I think so. Talking about acronyms, when I was in defence, we had a spreadsheet that was 33,000-ish rows long of acronyms and what they actually spelled out. So yeah, I feel your pain there. I think Sassy is so when that Zero Trust paper first came out, the Forrester paper, it was about 2011, I think. I forget the exact year, but I remember how inspired I was by that. And I was actually at our ATO at the moment. I thought, this is what we've got to do. But back then, to do Zero Trust at scale, just the technology wasn't there. It was just not there. But to me, the good thing now is when you look at Sassy and you break it down to some of the components, as you say, like identity, principle of least privileged, role-based access for people and devices. The good news is I think a lot of organisations will have a couple of those building blocks. So whether it's SD-WAN or whether they've already got their Active Directory sort of that's been refined over a couple of years to be working for them. Have a look at what we've got, and then, as I said before, maybe we can start to stack some more functionality on the top. So, for me, something like multi-factor authentication is a no-brainer for almost incident bang for buck. So, I think the good news is, even though we were rushed, we did deploy by and large, some really effective technology, and the technology has obviously evolved significantly over those last 4 years. But if you look at that as a platform, we've got a lot of the good building blocks, and now it's possibly not quite as a big job to start to consolidate into a Sassy system.
Yeah, and that's really good to hear. And my personal background, I've been in especially the networking side of IT for a very long time. And one of the big transformations I've seen is that as things coalesce, and networking always had a phrase around convergence, and networks were great at converging things onto themselves, but now I feel that they're being converged purely into security, based around things like Zero Trust. When it comes to the architectures, networking, Zero Trust, they are being rapidly folded into a much more secure model and cannot stand alone too much longer as we try to get those outcomes. It'd be great to get your view around, how you see network, security genuinely converging, that when I'm deploying new infrastructure, no matter what it is, it has to be aligned to my security, my governance strategies, and what you see from, how that will help when it comes to new and emerging threats. If I've got these things like zero trust enabled, my principles of least privilege, my policy enforcement, and all these things, it'd be great to get your view on that.
Yeah, and I think that's the winning play here. So if you look at Fortinet, and I'm going to sound like I'm in sales now, but I'm not. I guarantee I'm not. But that network and security as being one and the same has been basically the philosophy of Fortinet for 20 years. So we design security into every single, whether it's a switch or whether it's a AP, you name it. Security is absolutely at the core. So we're already there. But to get to, I guess, the more interesting point to your question, as I said before, the attackers are extremely innovative and effective in the early stages of an attack. So it's only a matter of time. It's not if, but when our organisation is going to get an attacker to get through that front door. But looking at the technology that you're talking about, it's absolutely within our power to make sure that attack is basically stymied right at the early stage before it can do any damage. Because if we've got least privileged, if we've got good network security, we know that this IP connection is anomalous, or this RDP connection from this box to this box is very, very unusual. We can stop the attackers before they get to that action on objectives phase and encrypt all their files and give us a ransom or steal all their data or whatever it is. So I think the idea for some of these convergent technologies that you're talking about, Julian, is being able to have great visibility into what's normal, whether it be a user, whether it be a business process, whether it be a network connection, and then being able to react even at machine speed with automation and things like orchestration, being able to stop these attackers before they do any damage.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely key. If we can limit the blast radius of the impact, that is half the battle won, if not more so. And I think that's really great. And anyone looking at that architecture, that should be a key component. Is okay. The concept always it's not if, it's when. What does when look like? And I remember attending one of your talks a couple of years ago, and I'd love to get your view on this. And you put some statistics out there around the biggest impacts in a cyber event of what organisations are lacking. And I think one of the statistics you reported on was lack of cyber incident response plan that's tested and things like that. It'd be really good to get your view around perhaps the biggest misconceptions you see around what organisations should be doing, and how would you in your role explain the reality of what needs to be done to a CISO or an IT leader, or even towards people that aren't technical, especially now that the board is technically on the hook for these types of things. Yeah, exactly. So great for you to, I know that's a biggie, but break that down for us a little bit, Glenn, how you see those conversations going.
I had a really interesting conversation with a CIO a couple of months ago, and this CIO told me, I've got my risk register and I can't get it down from high because, an attack is going to happen. So, the likelihood of this attack is 100%. So I've got this risk register that I have to take to the board, and it's always bad. And I just said, that's completely incorrect. So you're looking at that one side, which is the likelihood, but you're not looking at the impact side at all. So we might not be able to get that likelihood, well, actually we can. We can get the likelihood down a little bit, but we can't get it down to zero. But we can absolutely treat that impact side, and I think we can get that impact side down to as close to zero, whereas it doesn't matter. And I use the analogy, if we're in a building like yours here in Compnow and someone smashes a window overnight, it'll probably go into your incident register, but at the end of the day, it's not really going to be the end of the world, as opposed to, if someone came in and then set the place on fire. So two very different impacts, but the first one being negligible if we're able to stop it at that point. So I think if we look really, really closely at our procedures, and the other hard bit is a lot of people they don't exercise. So I'll get a SOC playbook. I might download some plays off the internet. Here you go, SOC team, off you go. they might not be the right context for your organisation. And if you're the first time you're actually enacting some of these plays in the middle of an incident, like that's where you don't want to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I was privy to and had the good fortune of attending a panel where we were running through, cyber incident response plan testing, and it was very, very clear that whilst the organisations there had plans, they had no testing regime,
Yes.
and and it was clear very, very quickly that even though they thought they were in a position of a good starting point on this, actually when things started going wrong, their plans very unravelled. And just as we look to wrap up, Glenn, what we talked around, with the transformation we've done, the life cycle position where we are coming out of that post-COVID world. We've talked around that convergence and coalescence of things in towards Sassy style solutions. If you were to give just a few pieces of advice out to organisations, be it IT, be it non-technical folk, as they're looking at that cycle now of that next generation of architecture, next generation of investment in cyber, what should their starting points be, on that journey? It's always interesting, I'm going to wait for something else, but you can never wait, really. You've got to make clever investments, and they've got to be sound investments. Just, a little bit of advice from your viewpoint, what you're seeing in the threat community and your vast experience. How would you see that journey in that next transformation starting for most organisations?
I think you've already answered that for me, Julian. I think in terms of preparedness, there's, as I said at the start, I actually am quite optimistic. I can already see certain things that we're doing in IT security that is making a difference. There's, whether it's a control around endpoint detection and response, whatever it is, there is controls that we're doing that is having an impact. There's some statistics around ransomware payments being made being a little bit less. So even though the numbers are bad, I think we are making a difference. But I think the most important point, at least for me, is what you don't want to be doing is making a cybersecurity investment when it's too late. If you now, while you're not under the stress of an incident, invest in some of this good technology that Compnow and Fortinet can bring to you, and a whole bunch of other people as well. The technology's there. Just make sure that you get it right for your own business.
Yeah, great advice. And Glenn, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I hope that was informative. Compnow provides IT custom built for your needs. If you'd like to know more about what we spoke about today, please get in touch with your Compnow account manager or email us at info@compnow.com.au. Thank you very much.